They said Station 12 was untouchable, a fortress where badges were licenses for brutality, where evidence vanished on command, and where even judges bowed to corrupt officers' demands. For 20 years, they'd perfected their operation. Every false arrest calculated, every bribe accounted for, every witness silenced. Until they arrested Grace Ellington. They saw a 78-year-old former teacher, an easy target, just another black woman to intimidate in their wealthy white neighborhood. 24 hours to process and forget. Instead, they gave her a front-row seat to their entire corrupt empire. Every conversation, every scheme, every crime. What they didn't know? Grace Ellington had taught generations of students to stand up against injustice. Now, with her son, the U.S. Attorney General, about to get a phone call, she's about to teach these officers the hardest lesson of their lives. Sometimes the most dangerous witness is the one you don't think is watching. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine aisles of Winfield Grocer, an upscale grocery store nestled in the heart of Riverside Hills. Grace Ellington adjusted her pearl necklace, an old retirement gift from her former students, as she carefully examined the fresh produce. At 78, she carried herself with the same dignity that had commanded respect in her classroom for over 4 decades. The store's fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished floors, creating an almost sterile atmosphere that matched the carefully curated clientele who typically shopped there. Grace noticed the sideways glances from other shoppers but paid them no mind. After all, she'd lived in this city longer than most of them had been alive. Officers Brad Beck and Kyle Soto stood near the store's entrance, their presence more intimidating than reassuring. Beck, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair and cold blue eyes, nudged his partner as Grace moved between the aisles. "Look at her," Beck muttered, his voice low but carrying an edge. "She doesn't belong here." Soto, younger and eager to prove himself, straightened his spine. "Want to check it out?" They approached Grace as she examined a bunch of organic bananas, their footsteps deliberately heavy on the tile floor. Grace looked up, her expression composed despite the sudden tension in her shoulders. "Ma'am." Beck's voice carried that false politeness that had always set Grace's teeth on edge. "We've received some complaints about suspicious activity in the store." Grace set the bananas down carefully, her movements measured and deliberate. "I'm simply shopping, officer. I've lived in this city for over 50 years. "Really?" Soto's skepticism dripped from every syllable. "And you often come to this particular store?" "I go where I please, young man," Grace replied, her teacher's voice emerging naturally. "This market carries specific items I need for my Sunday dinner." The store manager, Thomas Culver, a man whose pressed shirt couldn't hide his obvious discomfort, approached the group, his eyes darting between the officers and Grace, clearly having made his choice about whose side to take. "She's been wandering the aisles for nearly an hour," Culver offered, though Grace had arrived barely 20 minutes ago. "Several customers have expressed concern." Grace's hand tightened on her purse strap. "That's absolutely false. I've only just arrived, and I have my receipt from the parking meter to prove it." Beck stepped closer, invading Grace's personal space. "Let's see ID, ma'am." As Grace reached for her purse, Beck suddenly grabbed her arm. The force of his grip sent her stumbling backward, and before she could regain her balance, he shoved her. Grace fell hard against the display of carefully stacked oranges, sending them rolling across the floor. "Stop resisting," Beck shouted, though Grace hadn't moved a muscle except to break her fall. "I'm not," Grace started, but Soto was already pulling her arms behind her back, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Near the checkout counter, a young black man named Isaiah Stone had his phone out, recording the entire incident. His hands shook with anger, but he kept the camera steady, documenting every moment of the injustice unfolding before him. Beck spotted him and broke away from Grace, storming toward Isaiah. "Delete that video right now." "I know my rights," Isaiah started, but Beck grabbed his phone, twisting his arm until Isaiah's fingers released their grip. "Delete it or you'll be joining her downtown," Beck growled, shoving the phone back into Isaiah's hands and watching as the young man's shoulders slumped in defeat, erasing the evidence. Grace watched this exchange through eyes that had seen too many similar scenes over her lifetime. She remained dignified even as Soto roughly pulled her to her feet, even as other shoppers pretended not to see, even as the manager began directing his employees to clean up the scattered produce as if that were the real tragedy. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Grace said clearly, her voice carrying across the now-silent store. Beck laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. "Lady, you'll be lucky if we don't add assaulting an officer to your charges." They marched her through the store, past wide-eyed cashiers and customers who suddenly found their shopping lists fascinating. Outside, the late afternoon had turned golden, the kind of beautiful day that usually brought people out to their porches, but the sidewalks were mysteriously empty as the officers pushed Grace toward their patrol car. Grace noticed both officers' body cams had their lights off. "Your cameras aren't running," she observed. "Technical difficulties," Soto smirked, sharing a knowing look with his partner. The drive to Station 12 was deliberate and slow, designed to disorient. They took turns Grace knew led nowhere, making what should have been a 15-minute trip stretch to nearly an hour. She sat silently in the back, memorizing every turn, every street name, every detail that might matter later. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worn linoleum floors. The booking area smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Officer Beck filled out his report with dramatic flourishes, occasionally chuckling to himself as he embellished the story. "Let's see," he muttered loud enough for Grace to hear. Subject became combative when approached, attempted to strike officer, resisted arrest. Grace sat perfectly straight in the hard plastic chair, her wrists still bound behind her back. "Those are lies, and you know it." A desk sergeant wandered over, coffee cup in hand. "What have we got here?" "Disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assault on an officer." Beck listed off, each charge more ridiculous than the last. "Had to take her down when she tried to attack me with a prod display." The sergeant barely glanced at Grace before nodding. "Book her. Chief McAllister wants all the paperwork clean on this one." Grace's ears perked up at the mention of the police chief, filing away another name for later. She watched as the sergeant walked away, already dismissing her existence from his mind. They took her fingerprints, roughly pressing each finger against the scanner with unnecessary force. Her photograph captured her dignity even in handcuffs. Head high, eyes forward, refusing to be diminished. "I want my phone call," Grace stated firmly as they led her toward the holding cells. Beck's laugh echoed off the concrete walls. "Maybe tomorrow, if we're not too busy. Night shift's short-staffed, you know how it is." The cell they pushed her into was cold and bare, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in full view of anyone passing by. The door clanged shut with a finality that would have shaken a less resolute soul. Grace sat on the bench, her back straight, her mind sharp. She listened to the officers, retreating footsteps, to their laughter as they discussed their plans for the evening. She heard Beck call someone, presumably Chief McAllister, to report that everything had been handled cleanly. Through the night, she observed. She watched officers pass by, some averting their eyes, others staring with open hostility. She noted how certain files were carried into a back room, how hushed conversations happened in corners, how the overnight shift moved with the easy familiarity of people who knew their actions would never face scrutiny. In the early hours of the morning, when the station was at its quietest, Grace heard two officers discussing another arrest. "Just like we did with the old lady," one said. "Camera off, clean report, judge signs off, case closed." Grace closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea of the storm they had just brought down upon themselves. She thought of her son, Trevor Ellington, of the power and resources at his disposal as U.S. Attorney General. These officers thought they were following their usual playbook, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. As dawn began to creep through the high windows of the station, Grace Ellington sat in her cell, already composing in her mind the test that would bring this corrupt system crashing down. They had given her front row seats to their operation, never suspecting that every detail, every name, every procedure was being cataloged by a mind sharpened by decades of teaching and a lifetime of navigating a system designed to break her. The morning shift arrived. bringing with them the sounds of fresh coffee and casual conversation. Grace heard Beck clock out, his voice carrying down the corridor as he joked with the incoming officers about the troublemaker in cell 3. Little did he know, the real trouble was just beginning. Through it all, Grace maintained her dignity, her resolve, and most importantly, her awareness. Every laugh, every comment, every procedural violation was another nail in their coffin. They thought they were teaching her a lesson about staying in her place. Instead, they were providing her with all the evidence she would need to teach them one final lesson about justice, power, and the consequences of underestimating a 78-year-old former teacher who had spent her life fighting battles just like this one. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would shake the department to its core, though none of them knew it yet. As the morning sun finally broke through the station windows, Grace Ellington allowed herself a small smile. They had given her exactly what she needed, a front-row seat to their corruption and the motivation to tear it all down. Dawn had broken over Station 12, but Grace Ellington remained alert in her holding cell, gathering every scrap of information she could. The morning shift brought new faces, new conversations, and new evidence of the corruption that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Officer Beck's voice carried down the corridor as he finished a shift report. Make sure the old lady stays put until we get all the paperwork straight. Don't want any complications. Grace watched through the cell bars as a group of officers gathered near the coffee machine, their voices carrying in the early morning quiet. Detective James Wilson, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, gestured animatedly while speaking to two younger officers. You wouldn't believe how easy it is, Wilson chuckled, stirring his coffee. Plant a little something in their car. Suddenly that routine traffic stop becomes a major bust. Department gets everybody who matters. Anyway, rookie officer, fresh-faced and uncertain, shifted uncomfortably. But what about the body cams? Technical difficulties happen all the time, kid, Wilson winked. Equipment malfunction, battery dies, footage gets corrupted. Just ask Beck about last night's arrest. Grace memorized their faces, their names from their badges, every detail that might prove useful later. Her hands might be bound, but her mind remained as sharp as ever, cataloging evidence of their corruption. Down the hall, she could hear the shift sergeant, Patrick Walsh, reviewing reports. Beck's write-up on the Ellington arrest needs some tweaking, make it cleaner, more believable. Add a witness statement from that store manager. What's his name? Culver? Yeah, get him to sign whatever we put in front of him. Already done, another voice responded. Culver's got a history of shoplifting complaint at his store. Wouldn't want those to suddenly get investigated, would he? Grace's cell was positioned near the evidence room, giving her a perfect vantage point to observe the comings and goings of officers. She watched as Detective Wilson entered with a cardboard box labeled Evidence, Case NRA 4789. Through the partially open door, she could see him removing items, replacing them with others, carefully adjusting the contents before resealing it. A female officer, Detective Naomi Reed, according to her badge, passed by Grace's cell, her steps slowing as she glanced inside. Unlike the others, her expression held a hint of concern, maybe even guilt. She continued to the evidence room, where Wilson was still working. You can't keep doing this, James. Naomi's voice carried clearly to Grace's cell. One day someone's going to notice. Wilson's laugh was dismissive. Been doing it for 15 years, Reed. Nobody notices because nobody wants to notice. Chief McAllister certainly doesn't care, as long as our numbers look good. Naomi's response was cut short by the arrival of Officer Soto, who burst into the evidence room with nervous energy. Chief wants all body cam footage from last night deleted. Says it's a direct order from above. Above, Naomi questioned. You mean the mayor? Soto lowered his voice, but Grace could still hear him clearly. Judge Walters called personally. Says this needs to disappear completely. Grace's eyebrows rose slightly at this new information. A judge involved in the cover-up added another layer to the corruption she was uncovering. She closed her eyes, appearing to doze, but listening intently as Soto continued. The judge says we need to make sure this case sticks. Can't have any loose ends floating around. Wilson's response was immediate. What about that kid with the phone, the one Beck caught recording? Being handled, Soto assured him. We've got his details. One wrong move, and he'll find himself facing some serious charges. Throughout the morning, Grace observed a steady stream of officers entering and leaving the evidence room, each carrying files or evidence bags, each participating in what was clearly a well-established system of corruption. She watched as they casually altered reports, deleted footage, and fabricated evidence, all while joking about their weekend plans, as if this was just another day at the Office. Around noon, the atmosphere in the station shifted. Police Chief Bob McAllister had arrived, his presence announced by the sudden straightening of spines and nervous glances among the officers. Grace watched through her cell bars as he strode down the corridor, his silver hair perfectly combed, his uniform pristine. McAllister stopped at the sergeant's desk, his voice carrying an edge of concern. The mayor's office called. Wants to make sure everything's under control here. All handled, Chief, Walsh assured him. Beck's report is clean, body cam footage is gone, and we've got witness statements backing our version of events. Good, McAllister nodded. Judge Walters is going to expedite the paperwork. We need this wrapped up quickly before anyone starts asking questions. The chief's phone rang, and Grace watched as he answered it, his expression changing from confidence to concern. Yes, Mr. Mayor. No, sir. Everything's under control. The judge is handling it personally. Yes, sir. I understand the importance. After hanging up, McAllister gathered his senior officers for a meeting in his office. Grace couldn't see them, but their voices carried through the ventilation system to her cell. Listen up. McAllister's voice was tense. Mayor Halbridge wants this situation contained. If word gets out about what's been happening in this station, we're all finished. The Ellington arrest needs to be handled perfectly, no mistakes, no loose ends. What about the store security footage? Someone asked. Already taken care of, another voice responded. Technical malfunction. Everything from yesterday afternoon is gone. Grace heard paper shuffling then. McAllister's voice again. I'm meeting the mayor and Judge Walters at Morton's Steakhouse tonight. We need to make sure we're all on the same page before this goes any further. The meeting continued, with officers discussing various cases they needed to clean up and evidence that needed to disappear. Grace remained still, absorbing every word, every name, every detail of their corrupt operation. As afternoon turned to evening, Detective Naomi Reed passed by Grace's cell again, this time slowing to a stop. She glanced both ways down the corridor before approaching the bars. Mrs. Ellington, she spoke softly. Are you all right? Do you need anything? Grace met her eyes steadily. I need to make my phone call. It's been over 24 hours. Naomi hesitated, conflict clear on her face. After another check of the corridor, she pulled out a cell phone. Make it quick. If anyone asks, this never happened. Grace's fingers didn't shake as she dialed her son's number. Trevor answered on the second ring. Mom, where are you? I've been trying to reach you. Trevor, Grace's voice was low but clear. They're hiding something huge here, something that goes all the way to the top. What? Who's hiding what? Mom, where are you? Station 12, Grace replied, watching Naomi's nervous glances down the corridor. Son, I need you to listen carefully. These people think they're untouchable. They think no one's watching. But they've been sloppy, overconfident. I've seen enough in the last 24 hours to bring this whole department down. Trevor's sharp intake of breath was audible. Station 12? Stay there, Mom. Don't sign anything. Don't give any statements. I'm coming. No. Grace's voice was firm. Don't come yourself. Send your team. This goes beyond just my arrest. They've got judges in their pocket, the mayor involved. They're destroying evidence as we speak. Naomi tapped Grace's shoulder urgently. Someone was coming. Grace quickly finished her call. Trevor, they're hiding something huge here. She handed the phone back to Naomi just as footsteps approached. Officer Beck appeared, his face twisting into a sneer when he saw Naomi near the cell. Getting friendly with the prisoner, Reed? Naomi straightened her spine. Just doing a welfare check, protocol, you know. Beck's laugh was ugly. Protocol? Since when do we care about protocol in this station? After Naomi left, Beck leaned against the cell bars, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Hope you're enjoying your stay, Mrs. Ellington. Judge Walters is gonna make sure it's a long one. Grace met his gaze calmly. Every hour I spend in this cell is another hour I spend watching you and your colleagues break the law. Beck's face reddened. Watch your mouth, old woman. Accidents happen in custody all the time. But Grace could see the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She'd been quiet, observant, present for too many unguarded conversations. They'd been careless, overconfident, never considering that the elderly black woman in the holding cell might be more than she appeared. As night fell over Station 12, the energy in the building shifted again. Officers hurried through the corridors, their movements more urgent, their conversations hushed. Grace caught fragments of worried discussion about an upcoming meeting between the chief, the mayor, and the judge. Through it all, she sat quietly in her cell, a seemingly harmless old woman who had witnessed everything. They had given her front-row seats to their corruption, never suspecting that every detail was being carefully recorded by a mind sharpened by decades of teaching and a lifetime of fighting injustice. In the darkness of her cell, Grace allowed herself a small smile. They thought they were teaching her a lesson about staying in her place. Instead, they had given her exactly what she needed: evidence of their crimes, proof of their corruption, and most importantly, access to the very system they used to protect themselves. The storm was coming, and none of them saw it approaching. But Grace Ellington knew that by this time tomorrow, her son would have everything he needed to tear their corrupt empire apart. They had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated a 78-year-old former teacher who had spent her life fighting battles just like this one. And now, thanks to their own arrogance, she had the evidence to bring them all down. Trevor Ellington sat in his Washington, D.C. office, his mother's words echoing in his mind. "They're hiding something huge here." His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany desk as he processed the implications of her call. The U.S. Attorney General rarely involved himself directly in local police matters, but this was different. This was personal. "Sarah," he called to his chief of staff, "get me everything you can on Station 12. And I mean everything." Sarah Williams, a sharp-minded woman in her 40s who had worked with Trevor for over a decade, was already moving. "I'm assembling a team now. Do you want me to contact the local FBI office?" "Not yet." Trevor's voice was measured, controlled. "Let's see what we're dealing with first. And Sarah, nobody outside this office knows about this. Not until we're ready." Within an hour, Trevor's spacious office had transformed into a command center. Analysts pored over station records, financial statements, and complaint histories. The pattern that emerged was disturbing but not surprising. A steady increase in civil asset forfeitures, a suspicious number of dismissed complaints, and an unusually high rate of technical malfunctions with body cameras. "Sir," one of his analysts called out, "you need to see this." She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Station 12's arrest rates for minorities are 3 times higher than any other station in the city, but their conviction rates are nearly perfect. That's statistically impossible unless they're fabricating evidence. Trevor finished, his jaw tightening. "Keep digging." The phone on his desk rang, a secure line used only for sensitive matters. "Ellington," he answered. "Mr. Attorney General." Mayor Halbridge's voice oozed false concern. "I just learned about an unfortunate incident involving your mother. I want to assure you this is all a misunderstanding. We're prepared to release her immediately with our sincerest apologies." Trevor's laugh was cold. "Mayor Halbridge, I'm afraid it's far too late for that. But I appreciate you confirming your involvement in this matter." The mayor's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Now, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. The only thing that would benefit everyone is a complete investigation of your station's practices," Trevor replied. "And that investigation begins today." He hung up before the mayor could respond, turning to Sarah. "Get me Judge Thompson in the federal circuit. We're going to need some warrants." Across town, Detective Naomi Reed sat in her parked car outside Station 12, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the USB drive on her passenger seat. Years of collected evidence, deleted body cam footage she'd managed to recover, copies of falsified reports, recordings of conversations about bribes and cover-ups. She'd been gathering it all, waiting for the right moment, the right person to trust with it. Her phone buzzed, a text from Officer Beck. "Chief wants everyone in early tomorrow. Big meeting about the Ellington situation." Naomi picked up the USB drive, making her decision. She drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over, used their public Wi-Fi, and sent an encrypted email to the Attorney General's office. Then she drove home, taking a circuitous route to ensure she wasn't followed. Back in Washington, Trevor's team was building their case. Sarah entered his office with a stack of printouts. "We've got something. A detective from Station 12 just sent us a treasure trove of evidence she's been collecting for years." Trevor spent the next hour reviewing the files. Video footage showed officers planting evidence. Audio recordings captured discussions of bribes, and spreadsheets detailed the protection racket they ran on local businesses. But it was the connection to Judge Walters that made Trevor sit up straighter. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of bank transfers. "Every time Walters dismisses a case involving Station 12 officers, A large deposit appears in an offshore account linked to his wife's maiden name. Sarah nodded. And there's more. The mayor's been getting kickbacks from civil asset forfeitures. They're using a shell company to launder the money through local development projects. Trevor stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. They got sloppy, too comfortable, too confident. He turned back to his team. Let's make them uncomfortable. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. This is Attorney General Ellington. I need a team of federal marshals ready to move in the next hour, and get me Director Phillips at the FBI. The machinery of federal law enforcement began to move. Teams were assembled, warrants were prepared, and surveillance units took up positions around Station 12. Trevor watched the pieces fall into place, knowing timing would be crucial. At Station 12, Chief McAllister was in a panic. He'd just received word that Grace Ellington was the Attorney General's mother, and now his carefully constructed world was threatening to unravel. He paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. We need to get rid of her. Judge Walters's voice crackled through the line. Transfer her to maximum security. Lose her in the system for a few days. Give us time to clean this up. McAllister wiped sweat from his forehead. And what happens when the feds come looking? They won't find anything, Walters assured him. We've done this before. But they hadn't done this before, not with someone like Grace Ellington, not with the Attorney General's office watching. McAllister knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it to Walters. He hung up and called in Officers Beck and Soto. We're transferring the Ellington woman tonight. Maximum security at state prison. Beck's eyes widened. Sir, that's not standard procedure for. Since when do you care about procedure? McAllister snapped. Get it done. What none of them knew was that Detective Naomi Reed was listening outside McAllister's office, recording everything on her phone. As soon as the meeting ended, she sent another encrypted email to Trevor's office. Trevor received the warning just as he was preparing to leave for the day. Sir, Sarah burst into his office. They're planning to transfer your mother tonight. Maximum security. Like hell they are. Trevor's voice was steel. He picked up his phone. Execute the warrants now. Across the city, federal agents moved into position. Teams surrounded Station 12, while others headed for the homes of Judge Walters, Mayor Halbridge, and Chief McAllister. The net was closing. Inside her cell, Grace heard the increased activity, the urgent footsteps, the nervous conversations. Officer Beck appeared with transfer papers. Time for a little trip, he sneered, but Grace could see the fear behind his bravado. Before Beck could open the cell, the station's front doors burst open. Federal marshals poured in, weapons drawn, badges displayed. Federal agents, everyone stay where you are. The chaos that followed was almost beautiful in its precision. Officers were separated, phones and computers were seized, and files were secured before anyone could destroy them. Beck found himself face down on the floor, being cuffed by a marshal who showed none of the gentleness he'd denied Grace. Chief McAllister tried to run for his back office, likely heading for the shredder that had saved him so many times before. He made it 3 steps before being tackled by federal agents. Through it all, Grace sat calmly in her cell, watching justice finally catch up to those who had thought themselves above it. When the cell door opened, it wasn't Beck or Soto holding the key, but a federal marshal with respect in his eyes. Mrs. Ellington, we're here to escort you out. Grace stood, straightening her clothes with dignity. As she walked through the station, she saw the results of her patience and observation. Officers in handcuffs, evidence being boxed and labeled, computers being seized. Her eyes met Detective Naomi Reed's across the room, and she gave the younger woman a slight nod of acknowledgement. Naomi continued packing, her movements deliberate. What we built was wrong, Sarah. What we worked for was corruption, pure and simple. We kept order. Sarah's voice was hard. We made this city safe. Safe for whom? Naomi finally looked up. Safe for the wealthy, for the connected. What about people like Isaiah Stone, like Grace Ellington? When were they ever safe in our city? Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Federal agents were back, this time with more specific warrants. They headed straight for the records room, where decades of case files were stored. Naomi watched as her former colleagues scrambled to appear cooperative while subtly attempting to destroy evidence. But it was too late. Trevor's team had already accessed the station's backup servers, and every deleted file, every altered report, was being recovered. In his private office, Chief McAllister received an urgent call from Mayor Halbridge. "This goes away." The mayor's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "Or you do, understand?" McAllister understood perfectly. He had been the mayor's fixer for years, handling delicate situations, making problems disappear. But this time was different. This time they were facing an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be silenced. He made one last desperate move, ordering his most trusted officers to target Naomi Reed. "She's the weak link," he told them. "Remove her from the equation, and this all falls apart." But Naomi was already one step ahead. As two officers approached her car that evening, they found themselves surrounded by federal agents. Trevor had anticipated this move too, ensuring that the key witness in his case remained protected. The next morning, the city woke to breaking news. Judge Walters's gag order had been overturned by a federal judge, and the full story was finally reaching the public. News helicopters circled over Station 12, capturing footage of federal agents carrying out box after box of evidence. Grace Ellington watched the coverage from Trevor's office, her expression serene. "They never understood," she mused, "that their real mistake wasn't arresting me. It was believing that their power made them untouchable." Trevor nodded, reviewing the latest reports from his investigation team. They've been operating like this for so long, they forgot that the law applies to them too. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Williams entered, her face grave. "Sir, we've got a situation. Detective Reed's cover has been compromised. Someone leaked her home address to some of McAllister's people." Trevor's response was immediate. "Get her out now, full protective custody." But again, Naomi Reed proved she was always thinking ahead. When McAllister's men arrived at her house, they found it empty. She had already moved to a safe house, taking with her even more evidence: old case files, recorded conversations, and a detailed ledger of every bribe, every cover-up, every abuse of power she had witnessed over the years. The ledger proved to be the key that unlocked everything. Hidden in an old evidence locker, it contained years of meticulous records, dates, amounts, names of officers involved in various schemes. Naomi had been building her case slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment to expose it all. As federal agents pored over the ledger, patterns emerged. The corruption wasn't limited to just Station 12. It reached into other precincts, other departments, other cities. The protection racket was just the tip of the iceberg. Mayor Halbridge, realizing the extent of the evidence against him, made one last desperate move. He called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall, intending to paint himself as a reformer who had been working to expose the corruption all along. But as he approached the podium, he found Trevor Ellington waiting for him. "Mr. Mayor," Trevor's voice carried across the stunned crowd, "I believe these belong to you." He held up a stack of financial records. "Would you care to explain why millions in seized assets were diverted to offshore accounts in your name?" The mayor's face went pale. He turned to flee, but found his path blocked by federal agents. His arrest, broadcast live on every local channel, marked a turning point in the investigation. Back at the federal building, Isaiah Stone provided his statement, describing not only Grace's arrest, but years of systematic harassment and corruption he had witnessed in his neighborhood. His testimony, combined with Naomi Reed's evidence and Grace's observations, painted a damning picture of a system rotted from within. Judge Walters made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He called an emergency hearing, hoping to use his authority to suppress the mounting evidence. But as he entered his courtroom, he found it packed with federal prosecutors, journalists, and Grace Ellington herself, sitting calmly in the front row. The judge's hands shook as he took his seat. Before he could speak, a federal marshal approached the bench with a warrant for his arrest. The evidence in Naomi's ledger had included detailed records of every case he had fixed, every bribe he had accepted. As Walters was led from his own courtroom in handcuffs, Grace stood. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, the judge finally understood. They had all underestimated her, had seen only an elderly black woman they thought they could intimidate. They had never imagined that she would be the catalyst for their downfall. The day ended with more arrests, more evidence seized, more corrupt officials facing the consequences of their actions. Naomi Reed, secure in her safe house, continued providing information to Trevor's team, helping them unravel decades of corruption. Grace Ellington returned home that evening, finally able to rest in her own bed. But her work wasn't finished. She knew that exposing the corruption was only the first step. The real challenge would be ensuring that what happened to her couldn't happen to anyone else. As she sat in her favorite chair, she could hear the television in the background, reporting on the day's events. The storm she had promised had arrived, and it was changing the landscape of power in ways none of them had imagined. In his office, Trevor Ellington worked late into the night, building the cases that would bring justice to those who had thought themselves above the law. On his desk sat his mother's pearl necklace, recovered from the station's evidence room, a reminder of why this fight mattered and who had started it all. The storm was far from over, but the winds of change were blowing strong, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the federal courthouse as Grace Ellington emerged from her son's SUV. The crowd that had gathered outside erupted at her appearance, journalists shouting questions, photographers jostling for position, supporters holding signs demanding justice. But Grace didn't hurry or hide. Instead, she paused at the top of the steps, turned to face the cameras, and spoke with the clear, commanding voice that had controlled classrooms for over 4 decades. "I am not afraid," she declared, her words cutting through the chaos. "Justice will be served." The statement was brief, but its impact was immediate. Social media exploded with clips of the 78-year-old former teacher staring down corruption with unwavering dignity. Inside the courthouse, Trevor Ellington watched the scene unfold on a monitor, a small smile playing at his lips. He knew that look in his mother's eyes. It was the same one she'd worn when facing down school board officials who tried to cut funding for disadvantaged students. But the morning's drama was just beginning. As Grace made her way through security, another figure burst through the courthouse doors. Angela Stone, Isaiah's mother, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a piece of paper. "Mrs. Ellington," she called out, her voice breaking. "Please, I need your help. They're going to kill my boy." Grace reached for the woman's hands, steadying them in her own. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Stone." Angela's words tumbled out in a rush. Isaiah, still in custody on fabricated robbery charges, had been transferred to a maximum security facility known for its unfortunate accidents involving witnesses in police corruption cases. "He's just a boy," Angela sobbed. "He was just trying to help you." Trevor, who had joined them in the courthouse lobby, took the transfer order from Angela's hands, his expression darkening as he read Judge Walters' signature. "His last act before being arrested," Trevor noted. "Get him out." Grace's voice was steel. Trevor was already moving, phone in hand. "Sarah, I need an emergency hearing, and get me everything we have on incident reports from that prison. Focus on witnesses who never made it to trial." The machinery of federal justice began to move, but they were racing against time. In his cell, Isaiah Stone was already experiencing the special treatment reserved for those who crossed the thin blue line. The guards, many with connections to Station 12, made sure he understood just how alone he was. Back in the courthouse, Judge Rebecca Anderson's courtroom was filling up for what was supposed to be a routine hearing. Instead, she found herself facing an urgent motion from the U.S. Attorney General himself. "Your Honor." Trevor stood before the bench, his presence commanding attention. "We have evidence that Isaiah Stone's transfer was ordered specifically to prevent his testimony in an ongoing federal investigation." The prison's attorney, David McThompson, rose to object. "Your Honor, this is simply a standard security procedure. Mr. Stone is charged with a violent felony. A felony fabricated by the very officers he was prepared to testify against," Trevor countered, producing Naomi Reed's latest evidence, security footage showing officers Beck and Soto planning evidence at the scene of Isaiah's arrest. Judge Anderson leaned forward, studying the footage carefully. After what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "This court orders the immediate transfer of Isaiah Stone to federal custody." But even as the order was being processed, another drama was unfolding in Courtroom 3. Judge Walters might have been arrested, but his replacement, Judge Michael Sullivan, seemed determined to maintain the status quo. Grace's civil case against the police department was being systematically dismantled. "The court finds insufficient grounds for these allegations," Sullivan declared, his gavel falling with finality. "Case dismissed." Grace sat in the front row, her expression unchanged as her attorney immediately filed an appeal. They had anticipated this move. Sullivan's connections to the old guard were well documented in Naomi Reed's ledger. This dismissal was just another piece of evidence showing how deep the corruption ran. Trevor, arriving from Isaiah's hearing, was furious. They're still trying to play by their old rules, he muttered to his mother. They haven't realized the game has changed. Then let's change it more dramatically, Grace replied, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the journalists in the gallery. The afternoon brought a new wave of revelations. A determined journalist named Rachel Stevens, working with the evidence Trevor had leaked, published a devastating exposé. The article detailed not just individual acts of corruption, but an entire system designed to protect itself while preying on the vulnerable. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with shared experiences, and other victims of Station 12's corruption came forward, former officers speaking out, even court clerks revealing patterns of suspicious case dismissals. The wall of silence that had protected the corrupt system for so long was crumbling. In response, the police union called an emergency press conference. Their spokesperson, Frank Miller, stood before the cameras, attempting to spin the narrative. These allegations are an attack on every hardworking officer, he declared. We stand behind our members. But his words rang hollow as more evidence emerged. Naomi Reed's ledger had been thorough, documenting not just crimes but the system that enabled them. Each entry was a thread that, when pulled, revealed more corruption, more abuse, more lives destroyed by those sworn to protect them. The courtroom convened late in the afternoon, now packed with press and public alike, the tension palpable as Grace took the stand. She had waited for this moment, prepared for it during those long hours in her cell. Mrs. Ellington, her attorney began, please tell the court what you witnessed during your detention. Grace's testimony was devastating in its precision. She recounted conversations, described procedures, named names. Her teacher's memory served her well as she reconstructed the casual corruption she had observed. The gallery sat in stunned silence as she described officers joking about planting evidence, judges fixing cases, officials accepting bribes. Chief McAllister, seated at the defense table, began to sweat as Grace described overhearing his phone conversations about destroying evidence. His attorney passed him a note. We need to discuss a deal. But it was too late for deals. Trevor's team had been building their case methodically, using Grace's testimony as a framework to hang the mountain of evidence they had gathered. Financial records confirmed her account of bribes. Recovered body cam footage verified her description of events. Naomi Reed's ledger provided dates and details that matched Grace's recollections perfectly. The prosecution began calling witnesses, business owners who had paid protection money, citizens who had been falsely arrested, officers who had been forced to participate in the corruption or risk their careers. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. During a brief recess, Grace sat in a small conference room with Trevor and his team. The walls were covered with photos, documents, and diagrams showing the web of corruption they had uncovered. At the center was a photo of Station 12. They thought the system would protect them, Trevor observed, studying the evidence. They never imagined it could be turned against them. Grace touched the pearl necklace at her throat, returned to her after being lost in evidence. They forgot that systems can be changed, son. That's what I taught my students for 40 years. The afternoon session brought a parade of forensic accountants detailing the complex financial schemes that had enriched McAllister, Judge Walters, and Mayor Habridge. The jury's eyes widened as the numbers grew, millions in stolen assets, bribes paid through shell companies, evidence room property mysteriously disappearing. But it was the human cost that truly captured their attention. Isaiah Stone, now safely in federal custody, testified about years of harassment and profiling, his voice shaking as he described the night of Grace's arrest, the terror he felt when Beck threatened him, the helplessness of watching justice being perverted. I knew what they would do to me, he said, his eyes meeting Grace's. But I couldn't just watch, not again, not after seeing how they treated Mrs. Ellington. The defense attorneys tried to shake his testimony, to paint him as a troublemaker with a grudge against police, but Isaiah's sincerity, combined with the mountain of evidence supporting his account, made their efforts seem desperate and hollow. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom remained packed. Nobody wanted to miss a moment of what was becoming a historic dismantling of corruption. Grace sat in the front row, her posture perfect, her gaze steady, as more witnesses came forward. A former court clerk testified about being ordered to backdate documents. a businessman described how officers had demanded protection, money, threatening his family when he refused to pay. A rookie cop, voice trembling, recounted being forced to falsify reports or face retaliation. Each testimony added another crack to the foundation of corruption, another blow to the system that had seemed untouchable just days before. The jurors took endless notes, their expressions growing more troubled with each revelation. Chief McAllister watched his empire crumbling, his face growing paler with each damning testimony. His attorneys huddled around him, whispering urgently about plea deals and cooperation agreements. But Trevor had already made it clear there would be no deals, no easy outs, no quiet resignation. The day ended with a powerful piece of evidence, the recovered dashcam footage from Grace's arrest. The defense had claimed it was lost due to technical difficulties, but Naomi Reed had found it, buried deep in encrypted files. The footage showed everything: the unlawful arrest, the excessive force, the casual cruelty of officers who thought they would never be held accountable. As the video played, Grace watched the jury's reactions. She saw the shock in their eyes, the disgust on their faces, the growing understanding that this wasn't just about one arrest or one station. This was about a system that had failed its most fundamental purpose, to serve and protect all citizens equally. The judge called for adjournment as the sun was setting. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, with protesters demanding justice mixing with reporters waiting for statements. Grace emerged into the fading light, her head high, her spirit unbroken. A young reporter pushed forward. "Mrs. Ellington, how do you feel about today's testimonies?" Grace paused, considering her words carefully. "Today we saw the beginning of change," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd, "but it's only the beginning. True justice requires more than just punishing the guilty. It requires building something better in place of what was broken." As she walked to the waiting car, supported by her son's steady arm, Grace thought about all the lives touched by this corrupt system. She thought about Isaiah Stone, about the business owners forced to pay bribes, about the innocent people sitting in cells based on falsified evidence. The storm she had promised was here, and it was doing more than just destroying the old order. It was clearing the way for something new, something better. And Grace Ellington, 78 years old and unbowed, was leading the charge. Trevor helped her into the car, then paused before closing the door. "You know they'll appeal, try to drag this out." Grace smiled, the same smile that had encouraged countless students to believe in themselves, in justice, in the possibility of change. "Let them try," she said. "We have something they never expected." "What's that?" "The truth," Grace replied, "and the courage to speak it." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Grace watched the crowd in the rearview mirror. Signs waved, cameras flashed, voices called for justice. The system that had seemed so impenetrable was cracking, its foundations shaken by the very people it had tried to silence. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and Grace Ellington, former teacher turned catalyst for change, was ready for whatever came next. She had spent her life preparing others to fight for justice. Now, she was showing them how it was done. The video hit social media at exactly 3:17 a.m. Grainy footage from inside the holding cells at the maximum security facility where Isaiah Stone had been briefly detained. The timestamp showed it was from 2 days ago, and the images were brutal. Officers William Peters and Scott Davidson, both with known connections to Station 12, could be clearly seen entering Isaiah's cell after the cameras were supposed to be off for the night. What they didn't know was that Naomi Reed had allies in the facility's IT department. The backup system she'd helped install years ago caught everything. The beating, the threats, the warnings about what happened to people who testified against police. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Hashtags trended. Phone lines at the mayor's office crashed from the volume of calls. News helicopters circled over downtown as crowds began to gather spontaneously outside the courthouse, Station 12, and City Hall. Police Chief McAllister, under house arrest, but still monitoring police channels, watched the situation spiral beyond his control. His phone rang, a secure line he thought couldn't be traced. "This ends now," Mayor Halberd's voice was tight with panic. "Every piece of evidence, every record, every file, destroy it all. I don't care how." But it was already too late. Federal agents had quietly secured every records room, every computer system, every evidence locker in the station. The mayor's order to destroy evidence only added another charge to the growing list against him. Inside his palatial office, Hal Bridge was growing desperate. He'd called an emergency meeting with his biggest donors, the power brokers who had helped maintain the corrupt system for decades. They gathered in a private dining room at the exclusive Summit Club, 50 stories above the growing chaos in the streets. Gentlemen, Halbridge addressed the room of wealthy businessmen and civic leaders. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Our investment in this city's leadership is at risk. Richard Hamilton, a real estate developer who'd benefited from years of rigged zoning decisions, spoke first. How much to make this go away? We can set up a fund, pay off whoever needs paying. It's beyond that now. Another donor, banking executive William Foster, interjected. The feds are involved. That changes everything. As they discussed options, none of them noticed the small red light blinking beneath the crystal centerpiece, another of Naomi Reed's carefully placed recording devices. Every word, every scheme, every admission was being transmitted directly to Trevor Ellington's office. Meanwhile, at the federal building, Trevor's team was following the money. Financial analyst Jessica Reynolds had spent sleepless nights tracing the complex web of transactions that funded the corruption. Look at this. She pointed to a series of transfers on her screen. Every time the police conducted a civil asset forfeiture, the seized funds were supposed to go into city accounts. Instead, they were diverted through a series of shell companies. Final destination: offshore accounts controlled by Halbridge and his donors. The amounts are staggering. Millions of dollars meant for community programs, police training, and civic improvements had instead enriched the corrupt officials and their allies. The paper trail was complete, lethal, but undeniable. Trevor studied the evidence, his expression grim. How long has this been going on? At least 15 years, Jessica replied. Maybe longer. They got sloppy recently. Probably thought they were untouchable. The investigation was expanding by the hour. More whistleblowers came forward, encouraged by Naomi Reed's example. A clerk from the permits office revealed how building inspections were rigged to favor certain developers. A former police dispatcher detailed how response times were deliberately delayed in neighborhoods that couldn't pay for enhanced protection. Each revelation fueled the public's anger. The crowds outside city buildings grew larger, more vocal, signs demanding justice, reform, accountability. Local news crews broadcast live as protesters shared their own stories of encounters with corrupt officers. Inside his chambers, Judge Michael Sullivan desperately tried to maintain control. He issued injunction after injunction, attempting to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. But federal judges overturned his orders as quickly as he could write them. His clerk, Mary Williams, watched with growing concern as the judge's behavior became more erratic. When he ordered her to backdate a series of documents, she quietly added another piece of evidence to the growing case against the corrupt system. The mayor made one last attempt to control the narrative. He called a press conference on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by carefully selected supporters. But as he approached the podium, the wind carried the sound of protesters' chants from the street below. "My fellow citizens," he began, his usual confident smile nowhere to be seen. "What we're witnessing is a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by media sensationalism and outside agitators." From the press corps, Rachel Stevens stood up. "Mr. Mayor, can you explain these bank transfers?" She held up documents showing millions moving from seized assets to private accounts. "Or perhaps you'd like to comment on this morning's conversation at the Summit Club?" Halbridge's face went pale. How could they know about that meeting? His eyes darted to his security detail, looking for an escape route, but federal agents were already moving through the crowd, warrant in hand. The mayor turned and ran, pushing past staffers and reporters. He made it to the private elevator that led to the building's secure parking garage, but when the doors opened, he found himself face to face with Trevor Ellington. "Going somewhere, Mr. Mayor." In that moment, Halbridge knew it was over. The system he'd helped build, the power structure he'd maintained through bribes and threats and corruption, was crumbling around him. As agents led the mayor away in handcuffs, cameras capturing every moment, the image of the once powerful man, head bowed, being escorted to a waiting federal vehicle became the symbol of the day's events. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Federal agents raiding the mayor's mansion discovered a hidden room behind his private study. Inside were files dating back decades, detailed records of every bribe, every fixed case, every act of corruption that had helped maintain their power. "He kept trophies," Sarah Williams remarked as she reviewed the files, records of everyone he owned, everything he controlled. Trevor nodded grimly. Probably thought it was insurance. Instead, he gave us everything we need to take down the entire network. The files revealed corruption far beyond what they'd initially suspected: judges, politicians, business leaders. The tentacles of corruption reached into every corner of city government. Each document, each photograph, each recorded conversation added another name to the investigation. At the federal courthouse, Grace Ellington sat with Isaiah Stone and his mother, watching the news coverage of the mayor's arrest. Isaiah's bruises were still visible, but his eyes were clear and determined as he reviewed his testimony for the grand jury. "They thought they could silence us," he said quietly. "Make us too afraid to speak up." Grace patted his hand. "Fear is their weapon, Isaiah. Truth is ours." Outside, the crowds had grown larger still, but the anger was transforming into something else: determination. Community leaders spoke about reform, about oversight, about building a better system. The people were no longer just protesting, they were demanding change. In his private jet, attempting to flee to a country without extradition, Judge Walters received word that his accounts had been frozen. Every escape route he'd prepared, every safeguard he'd established, had been anticipated and blocked. The federal agents waiting on the tarmac were almost an afterthought. As they led him away, Walters finally understood what Grace Ellington had known from the beginning. The power they'd thought made them untouchable had become the instrument of their downfall. Back at Station 12, officers watched in stunned silence as federal agents continued their methodical collection of evidence. Computers seized, files boxed, decades of corruption exposed to the light of day. Detective Naomi Reed, now under federal protection, provided the key to unlocking countless cases of abuse and corruption. Her testimony, combined with her years of collected evidence, painted a picture of systematic failure that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about the money, she explained to federal investigators. It was about power, the ability to control people's lives, to decide who deserved justice and who didn't. The investigation expanded beyond the city limits. Other stations, other jurisdictions, other power structures came under scrutiny. The pattern that emerged was clear. What had happened at Station 12 wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. Trevor Ellington worked through the night, coordinating with federal prosecutors to build cases that would stick. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew from experience that power didn't surrender easily. "They'll fight back," he warned his team. "They still have resources, allies, influence. We need to be thorough, no loose ends." In the holding cells of the federal building, the enormity of their downfall was beginning to sink in for the arrested officials. Mayor Halbridge, separated from his designer suits and creature comforts, looked every bit his age. Chief McAllister, no longer in command, sat silently, refusing to speak even to his lawyers. But it was Judge Walters who finally broke. After decades of wielding power from the bench, deciding others' fates while enriching himself, he found himself facing justice from the other side. "I want to make a deal," he told federal prosecutors. "I can give you names, dates, details, people you don't even know about yet." Trevor listened to the judge's desperate offer with cold satisfaction. "No deals," he replied. "You had years to do the right thing. Now you face the consequences." The day ended with more arrests, more evidence seized, more corrupt officials facing the justice they had denied others. Naomi Reed, from the safety of her protected location, continued providing information to Trevor's team, helping them unravel decades of corruption. Grace Ellington watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting for change. She knew that exposing corruption was only the first step. The real work, rebuilding trust, establishing accountability, creating real change, was still to come. As night fell over the city, the crowds remained, their candles and phone lights creating a sea of illumination in the darkness. They were no longer just demanding justice. They were witnessing its arrival. In his office, Trevor reviewed the day's developments with his team. The mayor's hidden files had opened dozens of new investigations. The judge's attempted flight had revealed more hidden accounts, and each arrest led to new revelations, new connections, new evidence of corruption. "We're not just dismantling a corrupt station anymore," he told his staff. "We're exposing an entire system that failed its people." Grace, sitting quietly in the corner, nodded in agreement. She thought about her students over the years, how she'd taught them that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for. Now she was showing them how it was done. The city was transforming. The outrage that had brought people into the streets was becoming a movement for real change. Community leaders were organizing, demanding oversight committees, police reform, transparent governance. As midnight approached, Grace stood at her son's office window, looking out over the city she'd called home for 7 decades. The lights of police vehicles and news vans still flickered in the streets below. The crowds had thinned but not dispersed, maintaining their vigil for justice. "You know," she said to Trevor, "they thought arresting me would silence one voice. Instead, they woke thousands." Trevor smiled, seeing in his mother's face the same determination that had guided his own career in justice. "They never understood what you taught me years ago. That real power isn't in controlling people. It's in standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But the tide had turned. The corrupt system that had seemed so impenetrable was crumbling, brought down not by force, but by the courage of those who dared to speak the truth. The storm Grace had promised had arrived, and it was changing everything in its path. The basement of Station 12 was eerily quiet at 3 a.m. Chief McAllister, out on bail through his expensive legal team's efforts, gathered his most loyal officers in the dimly lit evidence room. Officers Beck, Soto, Peters, and Davidson stood in a tight circle, their faces grim in the fluorescent light. "This since tonight," McAllister's voice was barely above a whisper. "Reed and Ellington are the keys. Remove them, and this whole case falls apart." Beck shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with the feds watching." "I don't care about the feds." McAllister's controlled whisper became a harsh rasp. "Everything we built is crumbling. Either we fix this now, or we all go down." In a safe house across town, Naomi Reed sat reviewing her testimony with federal prosecutors. Years of carefully collected evidence spread across the table before her. Photos, recordings, financial records. Each piece another nail in the corruption's coffin. "The bonuses were just the beginning," she explained, pointing to a spreadsheet. "Officers got paid extra for every false arrest that led to asset forfeiture. The more valuable the seized property, the bigger their cut." Lead prosecutor Andrea Thompson leaned forward. "And the judges?" "Walters wasn't the only one. 3 other judges were on the payroll," Naomi said. "They'd dismiss complaints against officers, approve questionable warrants, whatever was needed. Each had their own offshore account, managed through the mayor's financial advisor. None of them noticed the red dot of a laser sight briefly appearing on the window behind Naomi's head. Outside in a darkened building across the street, Officer Davidson adjusted his scope. But before he could take the shot, the night erupted in light and sound. "Federal agents, drop your weapon." Davidson found himself surrounded. Malcolm's team had anticipated this move, had been waiting for it. As agents led him away in handcuffs, they found a burner phone in his pocket, direct evidence linking him to McAllister. The chief's desperation was growing. His phone rang, Judge Walters calling from his holding cell. "They're offering me a deal," Walters's voice shook. "Full immunity if I testify about everything, the bribes, the fixed cases, the offshore accounts. Take that deal and you won't live to testify." McAllister's threat was explicit, but Walters had already made his choice. Hours of interrogation had broken his resolve, and the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison had loosened his tongue. He told federal prosecutors everything: dates, amounts, names of every official they'd bribed or blackmailed. At the federal courthouse, Grace Ellington took the stand for her final day of testimony. The gallery was packed with journalists and citizens alike, straining to hear every word. She described not just her arrest, but the systematic corruption she'd witnessed during her detention. "They were so confident in their power," she testified, her voice clear and strong, "that they didn't bother hiding their crimes. They discussed bribes and cover-ups openly, believing no one could touch them." Police union lawyers tried to discredit her testimony, but Grace's recall was perfect. She cited specific conversations, named officers present, detailed times and locations. Each point was corroborated by Naomi Reed's evidence or the mayor's seized files. The day ended with a powerful summation from the prosecution. In the holding cell, McAllister finally cracked. I want a deal, he demanded. I'll take everyone down with me. Judges, politicians, business leaders. I've got dirt on people you haven't even looked at yet. Trevor stood outside the cell, studying the man who'd once seemed so powerful. No deals, he replied. But we'll listen to everything you have to say. Every name, every crime, every detail. And McAllister talked, for hours. He detailed decades of corruption, described how the system worked, how they chose their targets, how they laundered the corrupt system had operated, how itself. This knowledge was already being used to draft new policies, new oversight measures, new protections. Trevor Ellington stood in his office, watching as federal agents led another group of arrested officials into the courthouse. His mother sat nearby, reading letters from citizens sharing their own stories of abuse and injustice. This is bigger than we initially thought, he said, reviewing the latest reports from his team. The pattern we found here, it's not unique to this city. Grace nodded, unsurprised. Systems of power protect themselves, son. What we've done here is show that they're not invincible. The reform efforts were already beginning. Policy changes were drafted to require body camera footage to be independently monitored. Civilian oversight boards were established with real power to investigate complaints. Asset forfeiture laws were rewritten to prevent abuse. Perhaps the most significant change was in the public's consciousness. People who had once accepted police misconduct as inevitable were now demanding accountability. Communities that had lived in fear of corrupt officers were organizing, documenting, speaking out. Isaiah Stone, his bruises now healed, became a symbol of this new era. His testimony about police brutality, combined with the evidence of corruption, sparked nationwide conversations about justice reform. They thought they could silence us with fear, he told reporters outside the courthouse. But fear only works when you're alone. Together, we're stronger than their corruption. Lisa Carter, once known as Detective Reed, became a key figure in the ongoing reform efforts. Her testimony had led to investigations in other cities, and she now headed a new police integrity unit, training officers on ethical policing and helping establish accountability measures. The old system was built on fear, she explained to a group of rookie officers during a training session. Our new approach is built on trust and transparency. Her words carried extra weight. Everyone knew the price she'd paid for standing up to corruption. The final phase of trials focused on the broader conspiracy, the business leaders who'd profited from corruption, the politicians who'd protected it, the officials who'd enabled it. Each proceeding revealed more connections, more crimes, more abuse of power. Richard Hamilton, the real estate developer, was convicted of bribing officials to ignore building code violations. William Foster, the banking executive, was charged with laundering money from the protection racket. One by one, the powerful figures who thought themselves untouchable faced justice. In his cell, McAllister watched news coverage of the continuing investigations. The system he'd helped build, the power structure he'd thought impregnable, was being dismantled piece by piece.